Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondent Club of Thailand. My name is Panu Wongchaum, and I'm a senior reporter for Reuters, as well as the president of the FCCT. I would like to welcome you to this panel discussion on education during the pandemic, challenges and the way forward. It is surprising, isn't it, that education and the disruption that the pandemic has brought about to education has impacted millions around the world, but it is rarely discussed, especially here in this country, publicly about this particular issue. According to the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, school closure due to COVID have affected more than 1.6 billion children and youth around the world. And 1 in 7 have missed more than 3/4 of their in-person learning during these 2 years of the pandemic. And that's the global context. But what's about Thailand? So we're joined by our panel of experts. To the right, who's zooming in for this session, is Ajahn Nisha Pitaya Pongsakorn, a senior researcher from Thailand's Development Research Institute. I'd like to welcome her. And of course, next to her is Kun Thidarat Yingjaran from the Oxford Thai Foundation, who has some expertise about education. And last but not least, we're joined here by Kun Parit Wachara Sintu, the CEO of StartD, an education app that was launched just before the pandemic. So we have expertise from different sectors who are discussing this. Anyway, I would like to bring you to Ajahn Nisha first. Ajahn Kap, can you please tell us about sort of the challenges in the realm of education that we face here in Thailand during the pandemic?
Hi. First, I think we should line out the previous problem or the problem that we used to have in Thai education. I think there are 3 characteristics, even before COVID. First one is the low academic achievement of students, especially in basic education. The second one is the high inequality that we've seen amongst the rich families and poor family, rural area and urban area. And the third is the inefficient resource allocation in education. These are the persistent problems. And then with the COVID, it can drive more changes, accelerated some previous problems and also bring new problems. So the impact of COVID on education has been studied in many places around the world, and I think Thailand is no different. It's had a lot of impact on students in terms of physical and mental health, and also in learning. There are many studies about learning loss, that when students stay at home, they're not receiving the amount of learning as they should have if they go to school. But many research highlight on the loss of learning in terms of academic and cognitive learning loss, like math or reading. But not many research talk about the social emotional learning loss, such as skills in collaboration, communication, which are also important. Like many children, all children, we go to school not only for cognitive learning, but also for social and emotional learning. So, so I want to talk more about this problem. I feel that there is a concern about mental health issue and social emotional learning loss. Some of these skills are acquired in a specific time window, especially in early childhood. And they require a lot of human interaction to build these kind of skills, such as self-regulation, attention, or relationship building skills. And the effect of school closure and lack of, let's say, opportunity to learn these skills can impair the current students and the future students. And this should be studied and remediated in the long term. Another big issue is about the mental health. And I think in the policy making circle, we're not giving enough importance on this issue. It's been studied that 1 out of 5 youth are likely to have depression. About the same amount are likely to have anxiety because of COVID. And we haven't seen much government response or policy on this. But imagine a society where 1 out of 5 people are having like internal health in their head, and they're not capable of having a proper, say, learning or being part or feeling part of the society. I think this is a big problem. Another thing that we're not talking about much, I think, is the lack of opportunity for practical work skills. Many students could not go on an internship. They couldn't have vocational training in corporate setting. And this can be a disadvantage for them in the future, because skills beget skill. The work-related skills that they have now can give them more opportunity to find jobs, to find decent employment in the future. And during COVID, they couldn't do that. So I think we should talk more about this. And it's true what Kun Panu said, that we haven't discussed this much enough. Yeah, so I would start with this, and then maybe later we will talk more about the priorities and the policy that can help improve the situation.
Thank you, Kapajan. That's an interesting overview about sort of, what's going on here in Thailand. I want to bring you in, Kun Itim. I mean, in terms of, from your observation, you are yourself, among many other things, are running this sort of education app. I mean, what are the challenges and some of the solutions that you can see through this COVID? And we have this stop start school years through the last 2 years, and I know many of our viewers and our audience here, I'm sure they have children that that have to stay home for a long period of time, etc. So what's your view, Kap?
Yep, sure. I think, well, firstly, thank you for the FCCT for having me here tonight. I think Kun Nisha probably covered most of the challenges that we have been facing in Thailand regarding the education system during COVID. But I think just to add a little bit more flavor on what Kun Nisha mentioned in terms of the challenges, and then looking a bit ahead to the potential solutions that we could have in place to try and make a better situation out of the current education state in our country. So I think in terms of the problems, I think Kun Nisha already mentioned the problems that have affected students, right? But to be honest, the COVID situation has affected all stakeholders in the education system, not just students. So I think in terms of students, I think probably three key issues that we've seen. Number one is we've seen a higher rate of dropouts. We've seen over, I think, in the region of 40,000 students that have dropped out of the education system since COVID has come in, and that number is predicted to go up as high as 65,000. That is partially due to the fact that the economic crisis as a result of COVID has meant that a lot of families are unable to afford the additional expenses that come with education, especially when they're forced to learn online, and that comes with it kind of costs on devices, on the internet, etc. So I think that's number one. Number two is even the students that are still within the system are facing learning losses, as Kunicha mentioned. And number three, I think, is on the mental health issue. So the stress that comes with it, and the kind of the effect that has on the students' mental health. But it also affects other stakeholders as well, right? So apart from students, I think teachers over the past couple of years since COVID has come in has faced an increased burden in terms of work, because a lot of them are not used to having to teach online. So being kind of forced abruptly to adapt to teaching online has taken a toll on a lot of the teachers to adopt their methodology. It also affects parents, as we have seen. I think a lot of parents are now almost being expected to play almost a teaching assistant role at their own homes at a time when a lot of them actually have less time to look after their children because of the additional work they may have to do to make up for the lost income. But instead, the burden that they have in terms of looking after their children has increased, both in terms of the amount of time that they need to spend to look after their children that are staying at home instead of being at school, as well as the increased skill set that is required to look after the students' learning. So I think all in all, we've seen kind of challenges that affect all types of stakeholders in the education system. If we kind of think ahead a little bit about how we can get out of this current situation, I believe the solution in terms of fixing the education problems regarding COVID can probably be broken down into three phases, right? And I call them the three Re's. So in phase one, I define it as a phase where we are currently in right now, where we cannot reopen schools safely, right? And we have to kind of make do with either kind of these kind of stop-start or have to make do with online learning. I think in this phase, the priority is to what I call retain. I'll come into what I mean by that in a second, which is how do we retain the situation to not get worse than what has already happened. The second phase then is the phase where we're able to reopen schools fully, which hopefully will come sooner than later. I think the priority for that phase is then what I call recover. So that's the second re. I'll come again into the details of what I mean by that. And then I think finally the third phase is once we kind of climb over this COVID fence and we've reopened schools safely and we're kind of at a new normal situation, then the priority is what I call remake, which is how do we reform both the existing problems of the education system even before COVID, as well as the scars that have been left by this COVID crisis. So I need to go into briefly each phase one by one, and then I'll stop for the first round. Think in terms of the phase one, right, which is retaining. So as someone who actually is currently managing an edtech company that develops online learning applications, even we don't believe that online learning can fully replace learning at schools. We never believe that technology's role is to replace teachers entirely, but mainly to complement what can happen in classrooms. We still believe that those physical interactions between the student and the teacher, between the student and each other is still critical to the development of the students. So I think in that sense, we have to quickly admit this fact that online learning can never replace learning at school, although we have to try and make the best case out of it. And I think if you look at the situation in Thailand, I think even though we can never expect online learning to be as good as learning at school, it can be better than what has happened in the past. Online learning there's not only one format. There's no single format to online learning, but you can design a format of online learning that can at least make it less bad than what it has been previously. So I think for me, the priority in this phase is then to retain the situation and minimize the damage and quickly move to phase two as quickly as possible. Now, how do we kind of retain the situation? I separate into three things. Number one is how do we design learning learning at schools, so not necessarily in school, but learning that are provided by schools to be as efficient as possible. I think what we've seen in other countries' experiences is they try to minimize the amount of content that children have to learn as much as possible. So how do we reduce any content that may not be completely critical to the students right now? We cut that out in order to make sure that they're left with the most critical parts of the curriculum that is more bite-sized and more manageable. How do you get schools to kind of replicate or learn from each other? Some schools may be able to adopt more efficient online learning techniques than others. So how do we make sure that there's a sharing of knowledge between schools so that schools that have been less ready are able to pick up techniques and resources from schools that are more ready? Right? We've seen in the past where a lot of schools kind of rush into making their own learning clips or learning videos when actually they can leverage each other's resources and share that more efficiently. And I think finally an issue that I voiced out towards last year, and we've seen it explode in the past week, is the only grade level where you may not be able to kind of reduce the amount of work, the amount of the curriculum, is grade 12, because they're facing the deadline where they have to apply to universities. So what is really critical is how do you revise the admissions criteria to universities to not be too reliant on exam scores. Because if you rely too much on exam scores, then students who are not able to make it that day because they've fallen ill with COVID, or they have to restrict themselves or quarantine themselves, are going to lose out. And even those students who can attend exams, a lot of them have complained and have voiced out that 2 years of consecutive online learning have made them very unready or not so ready for those exams. So I think revising the criteria to cater for more than just kind of relying on just grade scores is going to be important. The second priority within this phase, apart from kind of making learning provided by school more efficient, is how do we find ways to return the 40,000 students that have already dropped out of the education system back into the education system. I think here one of the solutions I propose is actually think about how do we, and this is what we've done at the company as well, is we send out, we obviously could not send out to all 40,000 students, but we sent out to about 6,000 students, what we call learning boxes. So in a box you would have a mobile phone, an internet SIM card, and access to learning content to students who have dropped out of the school, right? And what that needs to be complemented with potential teaching personnel to help design the curriculum and look after the learning and the well-being of these students as well. Now, if you ask me kind of where can we find those manpower resources, I think one potential group that we could look at are the current students at faculties of education at universities across the country, or even people who've just graduated and are not yet able to find a permanent job. Right? So you can have the state or the government hire them as teaching assistants and match them up with students who have dropped out of the education system. In a way, it creates additional income for these students who are looking for work, and it means that the students that have dropped out of the education system have someone with the expertise and the skill set to look after them and ensure that their learning can continue until the economic situation gets better and they can return to the school. So I think that's kind of the two key priorities within phase one. Then if you go to phase two, I think there are three key things to recover, right? Number one is how do you recover the learning losses? So I think the government needs to help teachers at schools have a tool to measure the learning losses by individual. Because let's say if you have 40 students that come back to your classroom after COVID, each of them is going to be at a very different stage of learning loss. Some may have lost knowledge on certain areas, some may have lost skill sets on other areas. So how do you help teachers able to measure or even diagnose who have lost which area? So I think that's something the government can step in to help teachers have a toolkit to diagnose the learning losses, as well as provide potential additional teaching resources, as we've seen done in other countries, to provide kind of additional tuition to make up for the losses that have happened. Secondly is how to recover the mental well-being. So how do you ensure that all schools and all teachers are able to spot mental health problems amongst their students and have a set of experts, a set of psychiatrists, psychologists that they can access and get advice from? And then finally, thirdly, how do you recover the finances of schools and of parents as well? So how do you make sure that schools can still continue? We've seen a lot of private schools have to shut down because of the reduced tuition fees that they're able to collect. So how do you help prolong those private schools to continue, and as well as ensuring that there's sufficient budget to provide to government schools as well? And then I think finally, phase 3, so once we've kind of recovered everything and that has been lost during COVID and kind of try to heal those scars, then we have to enter the third phase, which is to accept that even before COVID, Thai education had its problems, right? And I think here, I'm happy to go into more detail in the next round, but I think my 4 key pillars of kind of remaking the Thai education system is, number 1 is how do you expand the set of welfare that we provide to our students to ensure that there's education is truly free. In Thailand, there are no additional tuition expenses or additional costs that students have to bear, as well as protecting the rights of students in school as well from being sexually harassed, from being violently punished, or from other kind of violations of student rights and liberties. Number 2 is how do you reform the curriculum to focus less on injecting loads and loads of knowledge onto students, but more focus on building competencies like critical thinking, communicating, which has been a problem in the Thai education in the past. Number 3 is how do you decentralize to make sure that the decision making is more at the school level, make sure that school principals and school management team have more power to decide on how to spend their money, on which type of personnel to bring in, or even decide parts of the curriculum that is more tailored to the students in their areas. And I think fourthly and finally is the future of education in Thailand is going to be driven by 2 key factors, which is technology and teachers. How do you balance between the two? Make sure that teachers do less of what technology can do in order for technology to take away the burden from teachers, and then ensure that teachers have enough time to do what technology can never do. So things like being a facilitator to classroom design, be an advisor to students on their learning and on their career paths as well. So I think those are the four kind of key pillars of what I would say is kind of phase 3 of remaking this Thai education system.
Thank you, Khun Aitim. Very comprehensive look at the challenges and the steps towards improvement in education. Kun Thitharat Krab, as Kun Aitim has mentioned towards the end of his presentation, problems in Thai education, exist long before COVID, and COVID is merely one of the many drivers, right? That has has revealed sort of the weaknesses and sort of the challenges as it emerge. This problem is more deep-rooted, and it requires public policy approach. It is sort of more balanced, I guess. What's your view? Maybe start with the pandemic first, but overall, this is a much larger task, isn't it?
Thank you. I think I'm going to start with, actually I agree with everything that the previous 2 panelists have already stated in terms of setting the problems, the framework and how we see what the problems are, not only in Thailand, but also globally. I'm probably going to put them in like a few boxes to see more of the, what the big picture is and what I think these problems are, and go into the solutions I see would be able to help solve these problems. And I will end my first round with a few current issues that are going on in Thailand, which is exact reason why I think we're sitting here today, because there are a lot of hot issues happening in Thailand, and there's not yet any solution in sight. So in terms of the problems I see, I think what's happening with the Thai education system and also globally as well is in terms of first the cost of people, the cost of education in terms of how people are not able to afford, and that's one of the root causes that eventually leads to inequality access to education. And secondly, in terms of the inequality itself that comes from other factors in society. And thirdly, in terms of the quality, which is something that I think both panelists have already explained a little bit too. So I think on the first point, we think that the educational cost, you look at students going to schools, although it's guaranteed that the first 12 years will be free of cost, free of charge, subsidized, fully subsidized by the state, by the government. But we see that there's still some other hidden and additional costs that students still have to bear. It could be coming from uniforms, it could be coming from extra, other activities that, that could actually be a burden, a financial burden from a lot of families that are not able to pay for it, right? Or if you go into the level of university, for example, we know that it's not free, and then even if you go to public universities, there's still a lot of cost that people have to pay for. And we know that a lot of good universities, fortunately, are in big cities and not everywhere in every province, for example. So a lot of students actually have to relocate and have to move, and there will be other costs like associated to that. What I'm proposing is that I think eventually, until even up until the undergraduate level at university, it should actually be all free. This is something that's been discussed for a while now in terms of public policy, and a lot of even political parties are talking about it too, that the state should fully subsidize the tuition fees until the undergraduate level for all the students who go to public universities and public institutions. I think what you can see is that before last week, the Student Loan Act was being drafted and is going to be passed, going to be discussed in the parliament as well. This is one of the major reasons why a lot of policymakers and influencers are starting to propose this, because there are a lot of students. We're talking about I think over 4 million students who are still in debt with student loans and not able to pay back. Especially during the pandemic, I think it's quite difficult for a lot of people after graduating to find jobs, and given the current economy, the current situation is quite difficult. So they find themselves to be in a situation where there are more and more students who have collected debt. And I think this will be one of the proposals that I think a lot of policymakers are considering, in which I'm also in support of. And the second problem that we see is in terms of the equality or equal access to education. Kunetim was just saying earlier that, even though we have the online option for schools, I also agree that it does not, perfectly, fully substitute with the in-site or in-person classes. So you still need the in-person classes. And if you look at the structure of schools, you look at the structure of educational institutions all over Thailand, and even in many other countries, you will see that there are not enough schools nearby or near your house that are of good quality. And I think this should change. There should be a model in which, if you are able to get into a school, the school near your house, in which it reduces the time for your parents even to send the kids to school. It reduces the cost associated with traveling or even relocating, living somewhere else. They should be able to get good education with the schools near their houses. I think this model, it's basically being used in a lot of places, even in the US or in China and many other places. I think it's time to actually restructure, how schools near your houses should be of good quality. And therefore, it should not be only the families or the students who are able to afford moving to big cities, those who are able to afford to live somewhere else, that they will get a better quality of schools. But talking about also the option of the online classes or online learning, I think that's something that we have to keep improving as well. This is something we have seen quite more seriously during the pandemic. We see that all the schools are closed initially, and then on and off, like Kun Panu said. And then there's still a lot of students, the majority of students who are not able to have access to even learning equipments. It could be simple as a smartphone for them to use to learn online. So they're not able to afford it because a lot of families are living basically day by day with minimum wage in order to buy even a few thousand baht of a smartphone, which is the cheapest option compared to laptops or computers and tablets. They're not able to afford it. So we see that a lot of kids are starting to drop out of schools. We see that a lot of kids are not able to get the full education that they're supposed to get. Even if there are some other options from Ministry of Education, for example, having teachers coming to their houses to hand over the textbook and hand over like homework, for example, it's still not quite feasible because they're like smaller kids are not able to self-learn, and they don't have anyone else to turn to when they have questions, especially when their parents at home are not the ones who are actually particularly have that high level of education. So in terms of the access, I think this kind of equipment or even internet, for example, it should be definitely provided for and for free as well, in order for students who have the option to do it online or eventually in the future, classroom learning. It could be even in a mixed method using both online and offline. But in order for that to happen, we have to make sure that there's an equal access to these tools for the students to learn. And lastly, in terms of the quality, I think this is something we have been debating and discussing for a long time in terms of the quality of education in Thailand. I think we see that there's a very big gap between the teachers and also even the learning environments and facilities between different schools, even if we're only talking about public schools. If you are in the middle of Bangkok, there are better schools than you are in the middle of nowhere, could be in rural areas, outer provinces. You can see that there's a difference in terms of quality of teachers and also textbooks and how the teachers are able to deliver the lessons. So I think in terms of the quality, this should be improved as well. But also, there should be a goal that we need to reimagine in education. What exactly are we teaching our students, we're teaching our children to be able to achieve at the end of the day? I think that firstly, we should aim to be able to educate our children and our students to be able to find themselves at the earliest stage that they can. They need to know what exactly that they want to be, what exactly that they want to do in the future in order for them to pursue that path, rather than we have a lot of graduates coming out fresh out of even universities in many levels, not knowing exactly what they want to do in the future. And a lot of students having a hard time choosing a faculty, choosing a major in a university because they're not sure this is something that they will actually like. So the aim of education is eventually should be for them to be able to find themselves, be able to know what they want to be and what they want to do. And secondly, I think we should teach them basically to have the foundation or the fundamental of the ability to acquire knowledge. I think when we see the education gets disrupted, every few years, a lot of big tech companies or big companies around the world are not hired a lot of graduates based on what they studied anymore, because they said in the next few years it may or may not be relevant. But they are now looking more in terms of their ability to be able to self-learn, their ability to be able to acquire this lifelong learning skill. And I think this should be taught in a very basic and fundamental level. And thirdly, lastly, in terms of what we should aim to teach the students, it should be the skill to be able to adapt to anything, right? Like giving the current trend, giving what's happening with education or the world these days, they should have the skill to be able to always reskill, to upskill, to relearn, to unlearn. So this, I think, would be something of very valuable for the students.
Thank you so much, Kun Thidarat. Also very thoughtful, kind of fruit for thoughts in many areas. Now, before we go to Q&A, I have one quick question to all three of you. I mean, all three of you brought this up, and this is the reality, right? This online, offline, hybrid learning. I mean, in practice so far, I don't have a kid myself, but in practice so far, I've seen that, it works for, high-income parents that have space at home. But for, low-income earners, I've covered stories in crowded communities, even here in Bangkok. Where are the kids, when they're stuck at home, there's nowhere to go. There's a real struggle, not just because of the lack of resources, but the lack of what Kun Thidarat said, learning environment. So when you talk about this hybrid education beyond the pandemic, I mean, what are we talking about here? Are we, is this going to be the new norm now that we can have a mixture of both? What is the school space constitute now, etc.? Maybe we'll start with you, Kapajan, if you don't mind. I mean, this mix, this idea of sort of hybrid learning, I mean, where do you see that going in overall, even beyond this pandemic?
By Ajahn, you mean me, I think.
Yes, Nisha.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm a parent of two kids. The older is 5 and the little one is 1.5. So I've been experiencing online learning for 2 years now. I think in terms of blended learning, um, I just want to go back to this definition of blended learning, as Kun Etim and Kun Jarat have mentioned before. I think we focus more on online and offline blended learning, right? But if we look around, like for example in Singapore, they start to talk about different kind of blended learning. Like you can blend something that you learn in the curriculum with something outside of the curriculum. That should be maybe students' own interests or the projects they want to do. You can blend academic learning and non-academic learning, like building relationship with teachers, with friends, using technology. So when we talk about blended learning, I think we should expand the definition, not only focus on the technology we use, but also the purpose and the interests of the student. So when we talk about this, then we will see more opportunities for children who are maybe lacking the access to technology. So, so in my work, I've been in contact with some schools, some in very local, rural areas, and they have invented many tools to be used in that context. For example, in some small, some, let's say, schools that is in the local area and the students' house are not far from the school, the teacher can go around and meet the students once a week or something like that. Or the learning box, as you were, I think mentioned, is also a part of activities that children can do at home independently or according to their age, maybe with some help from the parents. And they can maybe show this to the school or send it back at the end of the week. So I think there are many creativity here that we should look back and see that in the past 2 years, it's not only emergency learning, but there's also some innovations that are built from the ground up by teachers and by maybe some parents too. But yes, in the future, if we look forward, the pandemic might be one reason we have to close the school. But if we look in the future, the climate change and ecological crisis can happen. And we have seen before that schools can be closed due to PM,
the dust, right?
Yeah. Yes, and that can happen more and more in the future. So yes, we might have to be prepared for intermittent school closure in the future. And we should look back at the past 2 years as something that we have learned, some tools that we have invented, and try to bring it to the future. As for I think the short-term priority now is maybe not to just go 100% on making blended learning work, but we should also try to make the school open. And this is something that we can envision now, because if we look at the trend of the pandemic, the Omicron variant poses, I think, I'm not a health specialist here, but we have seen some statistics that it has less risk of developing serious symptoms. And especially for children, they are likely to have less symptoms than adults if they have COVID. So the decision of closing school for so long, maybe it's time to reconsider it. And if we look at the Ministry of Education policy, we can see that they've tried to create some measures that schools should follow in order to reopen the schools safely, so that students can have in-person learning while maintaining low risk of contracting COVID. But if we look at the local level, I myself I'm in Chiang Mai. So we've seen that even though during the period of time that there were really low risk of COVID in the community, the schools still remain closed because the committee that decide on the school closure, the provincial authority is very risk averse, and they consider, they give more importance to the health risk and maybe not enough consideration for learning loss of the children. And I think this is something that in the short term, in the short priority, we should push the government and the local government to reopen the schools safely as much as possible. Why extracting knowledge, extracting know-how of how to make blended learning work?
Thank you so much. I mean, yeah, you're right. The government is trying very hard now to try to maintain schools, to open the schools, right? And we have seen that here and in many other provinces where if there's some small cases of COVID or something nearby, they would automatically go to shut down again. And secondly, by February, we're going to start seeing the vaccination of young people, like, we're talking about 5 years old, right? But anyway, before, that's just the context I'm providing, but before we go to the Q&A, I mean, Kun Aitim and Kun Thida, any thoughts on this sort of blended education? I mean, you guys both mentioned it, in your presentation earlier, but I mean, what about sort of, the disparity and the space, the learning environment, that sort of thing? Aitim, you want to take a stab?
Sure, I think, for us to make the best use of technology in education, we have to firstly make sure that access to technology is a right. I think that's one important precondition for using technology in education. And we've seen a lot of countries actually waking up to this fact. I mean, we've seen countries like Finland that have declared basically access to internet being a right. We've seen countries like Mexico even enshrine it in their constitution. And we've seen, I think there is a state in India where the court has ruled that if you are going to say that people have a right to education, that cannot be true unless that person also has a right to the internet, because the internet is now such an important source of learning content and learning materials. So I think that's kind of a precondition that we need to establish. And I think it's not just for the realm of education as well. We've seen in this COVID pandemic how important access to technology is. We've seen the gaps in terms of the quality of life of people who are able to access the online world and people who cannot, right? Not just in terms of online learning, but it's also the ability to work from home or work from distant locations, the ability to get to health information much more quickly, the ability for agricultural workers to get to important crop information or weather information. So right now, access to the online world should become a right that everyone can access. Now, once we've established that fact, then I think technology can play an important role in terms of fixing a lot of the quality issues that we've seen in education. And I think if I were to paint a picture in terms of like a metaphor, I see teachers, if you think about a football team, right? Teacher is almost like a striker, and technology is like a defender. Now, during COVID, it's like a situation where our striker is injured. So in the past, we've been expecting our defender to play that role. And no matter how well he or she can play that role, can never live up to the expectations that we had for the striker. Now, once COVID is gone and our striker is back, then the question becomes, how do you make sure that the two can complement each other? So how do you make sure that the striker doesn't have to come back all the way down the pitch to chase and defend a corner, but he or she can stay right up the field and just focus on scoring, right? Now, so how does tech as a defender able to help the striker? I have four key levers or areas, which actually is an acronym for the word tech, or TECH. The first T stands for teaching resources. So technology can act as a library of good quality learning resources. Kun Thida mentioned already that right now, one of the key issues that we have is that there is inequality in terms of the teaching quality between different schools. More than half the schools in Thailand, I believe, are what are classified as small schools with fewer than 120 students. A lot of these schools don't have teachers that are sufficient for every subject. Some schools don't have teachers that are sufficient for every grade level. So grade 1, 2, 3, 4 students have to share one teacher. So what technology can do here is provide a library or a pool of teaching resources to plug in the gaps or to cover the gaps that school cannot provide themselves. So let's say, for example, one school may not have a teacher that is very proficient in English, then at least that school, if they can have access to teaching content made by a more qualified teacher in English, then that could be one way to minimize that gap. So that's a very simple way that technology can help, and that's kind of what we at Study at our company is trying to do. The next one, letter E, and it goes increasingly more advanced. Letter E stands for experience, which is actually in some ways, there are some elements where online learning experience can be better than offline learning experience. I think one simple example that I would use, and we've seen this at our company as well, is that especially with classes that have multiple students, let's say 40 students learning at the same time. Sometimes if you have a student who are not able to catch up with the class pace, they are sometimes too afraid to kind of raise their hand and ask the teacher to repeat himself or herself because everything goes by too quickly. You won't get that in an online learning environment because you can just kind of watch it at your own time and rewind the clip more than once if you don't understand something, right? So in some ways there are elements of online learning experience that we can design to fix the problems or the gaps or the deficiencies that we have in schools, right? And I think this is what I think is important for anyone who's designing an online learning experience, that it's not a matter of copying and pasting what is in the classroom and plugging it online. So a good online learning experience is not basically recording what happens in a classroom and then pasting it online, right? But how do you decide to match with the student's behavior? So we noticed at our company that a student may be able to concentrate for 1 full hour in a classroom environment, but in an online clip, that's not possible. So we have to make sure that our clips are shorter, more concise. There's always pop-ups or questions to make sure that we are able to get the students' attention and make sure that they don't lose focus. So in some ways, there are certain elements of online learning experience, if well designed, that can be better in those areas than the learning at school. Letter C is classroom design, which is in some ways, if students across the country can access technology, then it unlocks potential new classroom design for the teachers. One concept that I think educators have been talking in the past is the idea of flipped classroom, right? So in a world without technology, if a student wants to learn about, let's say, the Second World War, they come to a history class 1 hour, and then the teacher will spend 1 hour kind of standing in front of the class and telling them what happened, right? Now that's not such an efficient way of teaching history, because in a way, that information absorption can actually happen at home. So instead of the teacher having to spend 1 full hour with 40 students lecturing one way or communicating one way to students, he or she can even record a clip of himself or herself and sending it as homework to the students beforehand. And if every student can access technology at home, then they can watch that as kind of pre-work before coming into the classroom. So once they come in, they will be fully equipped with the information that teacher has provided. And then they can spend 1 full hour of that class asking teachers questions or designing group activities that promote critical thinking skills, communication skills that are important and are a problem that we're facing with the current quality of education in Thailand. So in a way, that 1 hour with your teacher in the classroom becomes much more efficient and much more productive. So that's what technology can do. And then finally, letter H stands for handmade, which is basically the ability to create personalized learning. So how do you make sure that you're able to know kind of for each individual student, what are their needs, what are their preferences, and how do you adjust the learning experience and learning content sequence to match those different needs, right? I think what technology can help with here is providing the data that is needed to help the teacher. So for example, we at Study, now that we have kind of over 1 million students that have kind of downloaded and played around with our app, we are able to analyze some data to try to understand that, if a student answered this question correctly, but answered this question incorrectly, based on the patterns that we've seen, what concept is he or she most likely to not understand? So with that kind of analytical tools that we can provide based on the data that we have on learning behavior of students online, then we can provide to the teacher to say, like, look, if you face a student that answered this question correctly and this question incorrectly, most likely is that he or she does not understand this concept. Therefore, you can spend a bit of time with him or her explaining that concept. So that kind of is some way for technology to help move education in Thailand more towards a personalized learning experience for all students. So I think these are kind of the 4 key areas: the letter tech, teaching resources, experience, classroom design, and then handmade personalized learning.
Great. Thank you, Kun Aitim. Kun Thidarat krab, any thoughts before we go to Q&A?
Sure. So I think I would start a little bit with the reality of what exactly is happening during the pandemic when there's an introduction into this hybrid learning. I think Thailand has never had, to face this reality before, in which a lot of times, 100% of the time or the whole semester is basically only taught online. I think now it's, there's a discussion in terms of how to make it more hybrid, and how do we go about that. And then secondly, I would go into why I think this is actually the future of learning, and why this is not only happening in Thailand, and how we can exactly perfect this. And then thirdly, I go into the recommended policies, in which I think would be able to, make this hybrid education or learning to be a little bit more perfect, right? So on the first point, what exactly is the reality? I think the kids who are really, really struggling are like the younger kids. Because I think was saying earlier as well, they're not able to focus for a very long time, especially when it's online. It takes away that kind of factor to keep their attention at hand. And especially when parents are not able, or they're not equipped to actually help the students to focus in front of the computers and things like that, it is really a struggle for them. But when you talk about like the older kids, students who are like in a much like higher educational level, like in university or even like high schools, it's much easier for them to be able to focus. So I think we have to distinguish there are actually two groups of the kids based on the age and the actual like mental capacity for them to handle the online learning. I myself is a victim of the online learning as well. I'm doing now currently second master's at a university in China, so I have to do it online as well. But it's actually way worse because there's a time difference, and we have to, negotiate in terms of having international students coming from everywhere. So sometimes I have to wake up at 2 a.m. to take class. I'm done with the first semester, so I still have one more to go. So I understand, even as myself as an adult who's learning, doing online everything, it's still quite a struggle for me. You can see in terms of the interaction, this very social aspect of it, me going to school, expecting to meet people, to meet friends, classmates, and be able to physically interacting with the teachers or the ones who will be exchanging their experience with you. So it takes away that reality and takes away that fact, that aspect, and therefore online learning becomes something that's totally, to me, very much not that interesting compared to actually going to schools physically, right? So you lose this kind of the social aspect of schools. Again, I don't think it's possible for online learning to be able to perfectly substitute for the actual on-site or in-person learning. But also you have like certain skills that you cannot teach online, right? Like I go around to visit different houses on behalf of the foundation and my other role as well. I found that there's skills, for example, like gym class or like swimming, for example, you will not be able to teach that online. You see a lot of effort where people put in, the teachers put in, but definitely you cannot teach someone to swim by just giving instructions verbally and telling them online. You can have like people studying certain things. For example, you need like labs, or you need something very complicated, scientific majors, for example. A lot of people are studying to be a doctor, for example. You cannot, go through all this, process without actually being there in the school by yourself. I'm part of the movement with the Thai Chinese Students Association, in which they're calling for the Thai students to be able to go back to China to study, because a lot of them are studying something that cannot be done online. It's been 2 years. So I completely understand that very aspect. But if you talk about secondly, right, like in terms of the hybrid learning, hybrid education, I think it's really the future of learning, right? You have things like Masterclass or Khan Academy that's like been popular for a long time in many countries, and it has been very successful. Again, going back to how exactly would be the factors that you can use, you can put in there and make sure that online learning would be something that can be suitable for different groups of students, different of age or different backgrounds, for example. I think we have to go back to the reality in which education has been disrupted, not only by pandemic, but also by how the world has also been disrupted, how the world is rapidly changing, and therefore education has to evolve and has to change itself as well. And all those stakeholders who are in education also have to change their roles. They cannot just stick to the same roles. You're talking about students, instead of being the one going to class and receiving, all these lectures from teachers and be able to rely 100% on the teachers. They have to change their role to be someone who's also able to self-learn, to be someone who's also able to acquire knowledge on their own as well. And it would be the duty of the teachers to make sure that they're equipped with those tools to achieve that goal. And also, secondly, in terms of the teachers, they have to change their roles from being lecturers, from being the one who also always attentive, closely monitoring the students, to be the one becoming a little bit more hands-off, or become like facilitators, for example, to be able to help the students to go through this process together. And also the parents who are at home, they probably have to take different roles, because a lot of learning are happening at home and not happening at schools anymore or educational institutions. So they have to be the one who have to be a little bit more hands-on, trying to evolve and trying to change their role to learn together with the students. And lastly, the role of schools have to change as well, from becoming like the actual physical buildings or infrastructure to be a place where all the students or the teachers come together to learn. It may have to change now to be more of a concept of being a medium or a platform, by bringing the learners and a lot of people together to be able to facilitate this kind of learning environment that's like going to help accommodate the students to learn, and also the teachers to be able to help them and facilitate. So the roles of these stakeholders have to change, because it has already been disrupted. If it doesn't change, it will not be able to catch up with the trend, it will not be able to catch up with a very, very big picture, right? So I think in terms of recommend policies, I think we need to really consider, firstly, in terms of the school hours. A lot of people are complaining when you're learning online, the ability to pay attention and the ability to be able to, really focus on online classes is different, because you take away all the social aspects, you take away, you only sit in front of a computer for a long time. It's very mentally taxing, right? So you need to really reconsider in terms of school hours. Should that change? Should that still be, for example, 1 hour per class, or should it be shorter in order to accommodate the new way or new method of learning? And secondly, in terms of how the teachers can help teach the students, the teaching method has to change and had to adapt as well. I think Kun Aitim mentioned earlier already that there must be ways to be able to keep the students to be focused, and for them to still be excited about coming to class. And whether that would be, you have to do pre-readings beforehand, and you come and you have more activities together in order to keep them focused. And I think lastly, for Thailand itself, I think we need to look at more at the big picture, and not just in terms of education as being one sector and one part of our lives. This is actually an opportunity for Thailand to be able to advance, to be able to get into that kind of technological disruption period that the world is going through. If you have, the students, you have the teachers being trained to be more digitally, literate, to be a little bit more understanding of this, how the world is now changing to be more based on technology. I think the whole society will also change, the whole populations will also change. You're talking about a shift in terms of the labor, a shift in terms of, how you can have new graduates being able to enter into a white collar labor group as well.
Thank you, Khop Kun Tida. So I guess we have about 20 minutes left. For those of you interested in posing some questions, you can go to the microphone at the back of the room and identify yourself and address which panelists you want to ask. We already have several questions coming in from our online audience, so I'm going to start with that. But if people here have some questions, please go ahead to the microphone. First one is from former Australian ambassador to Thailand, James Wise, who is also a member of the FCCT. He said, all the excellent speakers have more or less advocated major reforms. Much of the responsibility for reform will fall on the shoulders of teachers. Who is teaching the teachers? Are the emerging generations of teachers being well prepared for the enormous task facing them? Who would like to go first to answer Ambassador Wise? It is a tough question about the capacity, right, of Thai teachers, something that has been much debated.
This is the most worrisome aspect of any reform, because yes, the person who asked the question is right. All the credits will go to any minister. All the pressure and burden will go to the teachers. And I think that there are many reforms that can be done at the policy level. For example, when Kun Thidarat says that the education should be free, actually it's in the constitution. But why is not so? If we look at the way the government subsidize public school, we can see that the rate of subsidy haven't increased for at least 11 years. And this is something is the decision that can be taken at the ministry level, and it's not a burden for teachers. As for learning and teaching pedagogy, pedagogical change, that's my son, sorry. That, of course, will be a challenge for all the teachers. And Thailand have almost, I think, from 300 to 400,000 teachers in service, and some 10,000 teachers in training, which means that any kind of reform had to be synchronized with the reform in teacher education.
It's all right. This is the age of COVID. We're used to this. So yeah, this is the busiest time of the day in our house. I lost my train of thought. But when we look at the policy on teacher support, we see that there really not enough support from the ministry, or some support is in a one-size-fits-all format. For example, some ministry organized training, which is the same for any teachers. That kind of training will not give enough, let's say, experience or immersion for the teachers to understand the new way of teaching. And also one thing which is really important to consider is that teachers used to be students before. And the way they teach today is maybe something they learned unconsciously from how their teachers taught them. And it's really hard to unlearn. So we need a lot of immersion for the teachers to be able to see that there are different ways of teaching. We need to have living examples of what is active learning, what is flipped classroom, and all this kind of thing. So the traditional training will not work. The sit-in-class lecture kind of training will not work for teachers, but they will need a different kind of support, like coaching, on-site visiting, long-term, like fellowship or something like that. And so we need a lot more innovations in teacher training to support all these kind of reforms. Okay. Kun Thidarat, maybe this time you go before Kunaitim, and yep.
Thank you. Actually, I would like to give an example of my own experience. I've been teaching English debate under Ministry of Education for over 10 years. This is the exact problem that we had as well when we first started the program. We thought, the very goal of doing this project was to be able to have all the students who speak English and be able to discuss critically and be able to debate eventually. So we went on to different schools with Ministry of Education, teaching the students how to construct their arguments, how to be able to express their opinions, how to be able to critically think about different issues that are happening in Thailand and the world. And then after 1 year, we found out that after hosting a lot of tournaments and competitions, we found out that the quality of the students being able to debate does not change. Meaning that whatever we taught them at the very beginning of the year and towards the end of the year and the next year, the very quality stays the same, it doesn't change, right? And then we thought, what exactly is the problem? Then we thought, oh, well, we forgot to also teach the teachers who also actually be the one to teach them when we're not there, right? So then after the second year, the third year, the fourth year, we found out that by the time we are helping the students, teaching the students to be able to achieve this goal to become English debaters, we also have to teach the teachers to be the one to facilitate the whole process. And they have to be the one to fully understand the process, to fully understand how to be English debaters themselves. So then we went on, and then we decided to also teach teachers at the same time as the students. So I think to answer that question, I think the first step that we need to do is we need to actually get all the experts together and be able to teach your teachers. We actually call this very first stage like train the trainers, meaning that we try to have all the heads and the ones who are very, very equipped, very ready, and will be the one who become like the community leaders or the group leaders. We make sure that they're well trained. We make sure that they're able to understand the subjects fully, for example, in this case, how to do online learning or in terms of education reform themselves. And then it goes to the second step in which you have all these well-trained teachers already who be able to also teach other teachers who will have to receive all this knowledge and all this training in the second wave and the third wave. And lastly is something that you cannot forget, that this is a learning process that has to go together, not only for the teachers themselves, but also for the students. I think there are a lot of times like at this era where we have the students who may know more or less about technology more than the teachers themselves too. So I think bringing them together, both the teachers and the students, in this case, they can also help each other learn together. So I think starting with, train the trainers and have them go out and train other people and also learn together with students will be very much of a big help in this case.
Great. Any thoughts on the question? You talk about, the defender and the striker, but I mean, who trained the striker?
Yes, 4 quick points. I think number one is on talent acquisition, right? So I think firstly is how do you make sure to attract fresh graduates to want to pursue a teaching profession more than it's been in the past. I think we've seen in Thailand the attractiveness of pursuing a teaching career is maybe not as high as some other careers. And I think if we look at it from the attractiveness of that profession, it's not just a matter of income or welfare, but it's also on kind of career progression. We've seen a lot of people who decided not to pursue a teaching profession because they feel that their career advancement opportunities are quite limited, especially if they were to be, to give an example of Bangkok, even the level of attractiveness between teaching at a central government school, a private school, and a local Bangkok school are very different as well. So one is how do you make the package more attractive? Number two is how do you make sure that the teacher's job description sticks to what it should be? I think if you talk to teachers right now and ask them to do a time log of their activities, 40 to 50% of their time currently is spent on doing non-teaching tasks. A lot of it is based on filling out paperwork or doing administrative processes that could potentially be offloaded to other non-teaching personnel at the schools. So the question then becomes how do you, number one, minimize the amount of evaluation forms or documents these teachers have to process, and how do you make sure that the schools have enough personnel to take off this burden from teachers? Number three, I think similar to what Kun Nicha mentioned, which is how do you have a more decentralized learning and development process? So getting all teachers to go to a seminar and then expecting them to pick up those skills are going to be quite difficult. And we've seen that happen during COVID, where teachers are asked to attend seminars to learn about these technology and these kind of online tools. We've seen, and from kind of our company working together currently with 69 schools in Rayong, we noticed that the more efficient method of kind of coaching is not for them all, kind of hundreds of teachers to attend a 90-minute or even a one-day workshop, but actually to find a champion within each school that maybe could be a new generation teacher who are very used to these technological tools to kind of train with us, and then they will be the one that go and coach and mentor the other schools in their own school. So I think a more decentralized approach is a much more effective one. And then I think finally on teacher evaluation, how do we make sure that the evaluation and the career promotions are really tied to student outcomes, right? I think one perverse thing that we've seen in Thailand, and hopefully this will be a thing of the past, is if you're a grade 12 student and you want to take a maths exam to go to university, there are so many different types of maths exams you can take. There's O-NET maths, there's PAT 1 from the GAT-PAT family, there's what we call 9 Vicha Saman in Thai, or 9 general subject. And you see that the students' focus and the teachers' focus are different. So students will focus more on the GAT-PAT and the 9 general subject exams because those are the ones that universities care about. But teachers will only care about student O-NET scores because that's what's used to evaluate schools and rank schools. So when you have these perverse incentives and you get these perverse behavior where students are skipping class to go to additional tuition to learn things that are not in their school, whereas teachers are teaching things that students are not using for their university application. So I think that's something which we need to streamline. So yeah, 4 quick points.
Great, thank you. Good night, Tim. A little bit different. Is there P-Mix? You want to ask question?
Yes, I have a question to all the speakers, but my question is more on the social or mental effect of the student. I have 2 teenage sons, aged 14 and 16, so they managed to learn, study online okay, but they miss hang out with friends or playing sport with friends, and this COVID has been on for nearly 2 years now. So you think there will be any long-term effect on that social mental issue if this COVID still go on?
Yeah, that's P-Mix, by the way, who's our manager. There's a just before you guys answer that, there's a similar question from one of our other members, Kun Lisa Martin, who's a correspondent for AFP, asking about what kind of support that children have in terms of stress and mental illness. During this whole COVID disruption, a lot of children have struggled with stress of the pandemic and lockdowns. Their families losing livelihoods, perhaps domestic violence at home. How can schools support mental health of students returning to the classroom? How damaging has the yo-yoing in and out of online learning been for students' welfare? And is the Thai education system giving students strategies to be resilient during these unprecedented times? I mean, similar kind of question, what kind of support that the students have? I mean, any of you can start. Who you want to go first? Tidarat maybe, or?
Well, I'm not an expert myself on mental health or even social effects during COVID. But I know for sure that from my experience, knowing that visiting a lot of families and also working in a foundation myself, that I know that there are probably 3 key stakeholders who are able to provide the assistance. One would be the teachers themselves, because they're the one who are very close to the students, who are very close to the kids. Sometimes, you can even say that some teachers know the students better than the parents at times at a certain age. So I think a lot of teachers are actually being trained. I think even under the current government, giving instructions to notice if some students have showed some signs of mental health issues, and be able to spot that right away and be able to kind of provide advice, initial advice before it gets more serious to another stage. And also you have the second stakeholder, who are the parents themselves. I think this pandemic has hit not only the students, but also hit all the stakeholders all together. Staying at home for a long time, I think it has affected everyone altogether. Even parents, staying at home with the kids 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's never happened before, and they thought, having a school would take the burden off them, but now they have to be the one being the kids all the time. I think there should be more actually of the measures for the state, and also for a lot of organizations who are responsible and doing this advocating for mental health issues, to be able to tell the parents that to spot the signs as well, and to be able to give initial kind of help, assistance to the students if they're in any problem. On the third stakeholder, I think we all know that they're experts or the third party. It could be a lot of organizations are doing it, and sometimes the students themselves, the kids themselves, feel more comfortable reaching out to the third party and sharing their experience or sharing their mental health issues, rather than going directly to people they know, because of the social stigma, because a lot of issues actually cause actually from the people who are close to them. So I think that would be another option that are really helpful. But for sure, I think a promotion of these channels need to be more.
Other panelists? Kunisha, you want to say something about this mental health support and that sort of thing, or you don't have to?
Yeah, I can only share of what I've been seeing from the ministry side. Unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of measures that the ministry plan to support our children mentally. Unfortunately, most of the measures focus on hygiene and let's say disease control measures in school, unfortunately. But yes, we can learn from other countries. Many countries opened the school long before us, and there have been some interventions to spot, for example, students who have difficulties. And I think this should not be irresponsible only for the Ministry of Education, but they should work with other ministries, for example, Ministry of Public Health, the local authorities, to put in more support, because as Kun Aiti mentioned, that teachers already have a lot of burden on their hand too. And I think in this perspective that the government hasn't put a lot of support into this, it falls on us parents to, I think we also learned a lot of how we can manage our mental health during COVID, and I think we should be the model to our children. For example, learning how when to take a break, learning to be self-aware, knowing our own limits of what we can take mentally at some point in time. So I think, yeah, children will learn from us. They will learn from school as well, and learn from their friends too. And in some interesting intervention I've seen is a kind of a small session when students get back to school. Teacher can run this activity and teaching students how to be good friends, and they can spot each other when they see that their friends are facing some difficulties and how to support them. So I think this is it's difficult, but it's also an opportunity for our children to develop resilience for future crises that can happen.
Great. Could any quick thoughts, sir?
Yeah, so I think there are mental health problems that are created by COVID, right? And I think both speakers have mentioned in terms of the solution of making sure teachers have access to mental health experts who can help them coach teachers on how to spot signs and triage students based on the signs they're seeing. But I think if we look at the long term beyond COVID, right, I think the issue of mental health amongst Thai students is actually going to increase as well from two other sources. The first source is, I think, the education system and the education curriculum in Thailand at the moment is designed in such a way that adds so much stress to students. Kuntida mentioned already about the long hours. I mean, in Thailand, we have one of the longest school hours in the world, not including the hours that a lot of students spend on additional tuition. And it's a system that is puts a large emphasis and a lot of importance on performance at exams, right? So with that kind of mindset, that setup, it actually adds more stress to the students. And one sentence that I normally like to say to encapsulate this is, I'm worried that Thai education is killing learning, which is that when you're overwhelmed with so much evaluation and assessment and so much emphasis on grades and performance and exams, it actually reduces kind of your willingness to learn new things, and it makes kind of learning become something that you associate with such a negative connotation. And this does not bear well for these students in the future, where they graduate and they in a more kind of fast-changing environment, they will be forced to do lifelong learning and learn new skills all the time. The second source of stress is actually from potential violations of rights. I mean, this could be between student to student in terms of, let's say, cyberbullying, or even like face-to-face bullying, or some reports that we've seen from students in terms of teachers punishing students physically, physical abuses, or even sexual harassment, right? And this is a critical issue that we've seen in the past in Thai schools, and students do not have an outlet to voice these issues, because if they go to their teacher, sometimes the teacher is the perpetrator himself or herself. If they go to a school, sometimes they are pressured to not make it public because it would kind of bring damage to the school's reputation. So I think the solution for this problem is potentially a setup of a third-party organization. I mean, I draw parallels to what we use for human rights abuses in the military, which is to have a military ombudsman, which can take, it's kind of a third-party investigator that can take these reports and investigate these reports. So I think maybe a similar sort of setup may be required to look into kind of violation of student rights that happen at schools. That could be another cause of mental health problems that we see.
Thank you, Kunitim. We have probably room for one or two more questions before we run out of time. We have another one from our online audience, actually. Or maybe we go to you first.
My daughter is in Zurich with her mother, exactly the same issues as in Thailand. And I did some reading online, and I see that Australia has been teaching children for decades remotely. And where we all know that Thai children are much smarter and much better educated than Australian kids. But what I want to say was, if you send the children home to their parents, there does become a big parental responsibility to make sure that the children are educated. And I know this lady here is going to take this super seriously, but did anyone actually talk to the parents en masse of children? Because it is always, the best educated children always come from like parents that are interested in their education.
Right.
And this has just exacerbated the fact, you know. And did Thailand actually go and talk to the parents and say, look, okay, you guys have to take a bloody interest, an interest in your child's education much more, which would be a positive thing for the future, actually. And I don't know about Thailand. I don't know.
Well, it's an interesting thought about parent responsibility. Anyone want to take a stab at this? I mean, you don't have to. I mean, any thought? I mean, has there been, like, for example, Kunisha, has there been like studies done, quantitatively talk to parents or anything like that during this period? I mean, it is interesting to think about parents' responsibility for education.
I have two information to share, I think. The first one is, according to research data, it's true that the interests of parents in their child's education affect the education outcome of the students. This has been studied worldwide with World Bank data. But during COVID, let's say there's some exhaustion. Like I myself, as an educator or researcher in education, I paid a lot of importance to my children's education. But when you suddenly become teacher overnight at home, and you also have to deal with your work and the stress, and I'm lucky that I don't have like I didn't lose my job or anything, but some family are much more in the trouble. There's a lot of stress, and we've seen a rise in child abuse at home and stress at home. So I think all the parents love their children, but sometimes they give them too much responsibility in the task that, like, sometimes they don't know what to do. It's really stressful, and that should be parental support as well. In many education systems, the Ministry of Education in different countries not only give support to teachers and students, but they also give support to parents. For example, they give some guidelines of what parents should do at home, what kind of activities they should do with their kids, or what kind of, let's say, perspective they should have. And I think one thing which is really important that should be given to parents and children and teachers all alike is that learning is not lost forever. And during these 2 years was very difficult. It is still difficult, but we can recover. We can build back better. And this is what the government is going to do. I think if there's this kind of communication, it will relieve a lot of stress of the parents. But of course, not parents are the same. And I have seen that there are many parents too that think that is the role of the schools to take care of their children. I've talked to many teachers who complain about this, that there are many parents who just send their kids to school and they think that they don't have to do anything at all. It's all teachers' responsibility right now. I think this kind of mindset should change too, because everybody can play important role to help our children, not only the teacher, not only the parents, but we have to join hand and do it together.
Right. Any other thoughts? I guess if not, then one more question before we close this panel. This is from an online watcher called Wayne Aaron. Question to all panelists. The upper middle class in Thailand are generally very highly educated, and for generations many have received education training abroad for secondary and tertiary education. However, there seems to be very large knowing and doing gap in Thailand as manifested in more social ills such as corruption, environmental degradation, etc. Could the panelists please share their thoughts? I mean, I guess in the realm of education, we have many people in government and elsewhere and in public sphere that are trained abroad, that learn a lot from abroad. I think all of us here, including myself, but there seems to be this gap. I mean, any thought? And this is quite a larger question, I guess, about Thailand, not just education. Tim, I mean, you seem to be nodding.
Yeah, I confess that I'm one of those people who benefited from, I guess, time studying abroad. I think I just end on this point, and I think to answer this question also to end this panel from my side, is I think it goes back to the fundamental question of whether we or the policymakers in Thailand have the same view of why we even need to go to schools, or what is the purpose of education, right? Because I think if that viewpoint is not clear or it's not aligned across the country, then it poses an issue. From my perspective, if you ask kind of a very fundamental question, why students have to even go to schools, I think it's three purposes, and I don't think currently the Thai education system is designed for those three purposes. The first purpose is that school should be a safe environment for students to be able to learn out or find out what they're good at, what they're not good at, what they like to do, what they don't like to do, right? In order to have that environment, you need to make sure that the system is flexible enough, the curriculum is flexible enough for students to pursue their passions. But what we are seeing right now is that students have very little choice in what they can study at school, right? If they go from, well, first of all, there's a heavy emphasis on academic performance and performing well on academic subjects versus kind of extracurricular or non-academic subjects. If you perform well at elementary or lower secondary school, then you are kind of expected to pursue, in Thailand for upper secondary, it's broken primarily for most schools into two paths, which is social sciences or maths and sciences. So if you perform well in lower secondary, there is almost an expectation or a social norm that you pursue the maths and sciences track, even if you may prefer or you find yourself more passionate about social sciences. If you perform well at upper secondary school, then you're expected to go to universities. You're not even allowed kind of the space of mind or environment to think about whether you could consider going to vocational schools or even going straight into work, right? So there's this social norm which almost lays out one single track for every student to go down. So I think that's the kind of the first failure. The second purpose of going to school is, I think, to equip students or younger generations to be ready for the future, right? And we know that in the future, as Kuntida mentioned, the different skills that are required, things like critical thinking, communications, being able to work in a team is what's most necessary, rather than remembering the knowledge or the information, right? So then if you look at the way history lessons are designed in Thailand, is it really designed in such a way to help develop those skills for students? Because if you think that, I mean, if you ask like why are you even learning history, right? For me, it's not a matter of getting students to memorize what happened in the past, because you can always Google that, right? But what's more important is coaching the students with the ability to compare different sources of evidence, conflicting sources, and then being able to critically analyze and distinguish for themselves what is more believable, what is more credible, what is their own personal viewpoint, right? But you see that at the moment, history lessons in Thai schools are not designed in such a way. And the third and final purpose of going to school is, I think, to help prepare students to be an active citizen in a democratic country, right? We know everyone talks about corruption. I think in the question that was mentioned about corruption as well. We know it's a big issue in Thailand recently. I think as of today, we just fell down below the ranking again for however many consecutive years. The solution so far in Thai school is to get students to memorize or recite that in Thai is "โตไปไม่โกง," which is when I grow up, I'm not going to be corrupt, right? But when students actually end up asking questions at a school level, like how transparent are their budgets managed, or they start asking, hey, I see in this budget there's supposed to be like 2 sets of computer rooms. Why is there only 1? When they start asking these questions, they're kind of faced with a response from sometimes from the school saying, this is none of the students' business, none of children's business, or in Thai, เป็นเรื่องของผู้ใหญ่, right? So that's a bit contradictory in the sense that students are not being able to allow, or don't have the environment in the school to practice being an active citizen and asking these questions. So I think in that sense, we need to come back to this fundamental question, which is like, why are we asking students to go to school? And I think for me, I put my personal viewpoint that there are these 3 purposes. And I think until we can get to an agreement, then it's very hard to have a clear roadmap on how we are going to reform the system.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kun Aitim. Kun Thidararat, maybe you can answer this, also product of Western education and China.
We all are here. So basically, let me just like recap the question, right? The question basically puts an assumption on a tourism statement that highly educated people cannot successfully solve all the social problems. This is not only in Thailand. I think this is a reality for humanity. We have seen the pandemic. We've seen other countries in which you have very, very highly educated people, even very smart people coming from different channels, and not only formal education as well, not being able to solve all these social problems. I think it goes into, firstly, we need to look at, there are actually different factors that creates all these like social problems. It could be corruption, it could be climate change, it could be any other things. But I think one thing that we can all agree on is that all these social problems keep evolving and keep happening. It's not possible for us to pinpoint a point of utopia where we don't have any social problems anymore. But I think if you ask for my 2 cents, I would say, firstly, we need to really look at how exactly we can come about together to solve all these social problems and not only rely on highly educated people, only the middle upper class in Thailand or in any other country, right? We need to look at how we can come together to produce about like collaborative policies. We need to really bring all the stakeholders in the society together to think about how can we best solve all these problems. And secondly, I think we really need to talk about how do we train other people as well in the society to be like societies like watchdogs, to make sure that all these social problems are not only the problems or responsibilities of certain selected groups of people. I think we need to really train a lot of people in society to be able to say, hey, maybe I got a better solution, and how do we listen to them, and how do we go about to solve all these problems. I think lastly, we really need to look at, the aspect in which we may not be able to 100% eradicate all these like social problems, but I think we still have to keep trying and keep trying harder, right? In terms of cracking our brains and trying to find the best possible solutions to go about this. So I think going back to the very tourism statement, I don't think that anyone in society, a selected group of people can actually bring about solutions to all these social problems. We need to really keep trying as a humanity and keep trying harder.
Great, thank you, Kun Thidararat. Kun Nisha, final words, doesn't have to be about this question. I mean, what's your thought? In fact, if you don't mind, I want to pose one question. I know that we're about to run out of time, but this disruption from COVID to Thai education, has it disrupted extra tuition? These tutor after class and all this sort of stuff, which has been such a plague, right? I mean, I never seen anyone. I never had to do any of that when I was growing up in Australia. Has this disrupted the tuition trend in Thailand, or is it morphing into this online? Everyone's online like 24/7 to study all the time.
Why am I the only one getting like special question? Okay, the tuition schools, tutoring schools. Okay, the trend before COVID, these kind of schools are declining already.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, due to the low birth rate in Thailand. And this year is like historical low birth rate. So fewer students going to normal school, fewer students going to tutoring school. But at the same time with COVID, we've seen different kind of tutoring too. For example, in online tutoring, or language tutoring one-on-one using Zoom. There are let's say more diversified kind of tutoring happening. Yes, but for me, I would not think of tutoring schools as a source of the problem. I see it more as the result of the problems. One of the problem is the university entrance exam criteria, as you Kuneti mentioned. I think it's something really influential. For example, in the past few years, the TOPR, I'm not sure how it's called, like the committee of university that decide on the university entrance criteria, they change for the first time that they will consider the portfolio of students. It's the first round of TCAS. And with that change, it creates a different kind of tutoring school. Tutoring school that teach your children to make portfolio, for example. So it's really interesting to see that a tiny change in the system can trigger, other part of the systems to change. And that come back to the question, the previous question. I think social problems, they like climate change, education, they have this characteristic of wicked problem. When you change some part of the problem, you don't know what reaction it will trigger in other part of the system. So it's really hard to change and it's really hard to solve. If we can solve it, I don't even know if we can solve it. But I totally agree with Kunti Darat that we should come together and try to solve it anyway. And it's true that a lot of thinking is happening with the policymaker who have training from abroad and everything, and maybe little exposure to what's happening in school, and also the people who do things in school, like teachers. Most of them have little international exposure, but it doesn't mean that they cannot work together. And both of them have different kind of strengths. For example, people who are highly educated and who have international exposure, they can also learn examples from other countries and trying to make it and adapt it to Thailand. And people who are doing the groundwork in the field, they also know the context, so they can help contextualize those interventions that come from abroad. And I think we should think more about not separating groups of people and say they cannot work together, but try to bridge the gap. And I think one key thing for the policymakers is to have intellectual humility to say that maybe we don't know all the things. Maybe something the teachers know better than us, some things parents know better than us, and listen to them. So, students have something to say, so we should listen to them. I think this kind of mindset of empathy, of humility can help us bridge the gap.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Empathy, community, very good words to end our panel discussion on education. I would like to thank all our special guests, Kunisha, Kunti Darat, Kunaitim, for participating. A special thanks to Kunti Darat for helping me organize this panel as well. I think it's very timely, and I think that it's an important conversation that I personally, as a Thai citizen, want to see more in the Thai public as well going forward, as you know, education is an underlying issue in this country. Just a quick sort of housekeeping notes. Tomorrow we have a panel on what's next for the monarchy reform movement. That will be quite interesting, I hope. And also on the 31st of January, next Monday, we have a panel discussion hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Thailand's hosting of APEC this year. And lastly, on the 1st of February, we have another panel discussion on the coup anniversary of Myanmar. So on that note, I, Panu Wongshum, want to thank everyone for tuning in. For those of you watching online and interested in this sort of conversation, feel free to become our members going forward. Thank you again, and good night. ขอบคุณครับ ขอบคุณนะครับ ขอบคุณนะครับ